Hey there. Welcome back to the quiet side of time. The fire has lowered itself into coals, and the wind no longer knocks. Tonight, we drift into the steam-laced basins of medieval castles, where linen hissed beneath boiled rainwater, and strange salt rites took place behind walls no longer standing. Far from kings and battles, we will follow the soft rituals of the unseen. Women who stirred lye with wooden paddles, who folded cloth still warm from breath, who whispered over stains that would not lift. There were chests locked tight with iron clasps, and garments marked by things not spoken. Dim the lights. Let your breath slow. Place your thoughts beside the pillow. The day has given all it had. The night asks nothing but stillness. Let the body grow heavy. Let the floor disappear. If calm stories like this help you rest, you can tap subscribe now. This story will be here either way, waiting like a folded sheet. We'll begin with water, warm, slow, echoing through stone, and somewhere inside it, I've saved something rare for the very end. In a castle's underbelly, where sunlight rarely reached, there lay the washing quarters, stone-walled, soot-blushed, and always damp. The air was thick with old water and older labor. Arched ceilings echoed every movement, the slosh of buckets, the scrape of wooden paddles, the soft drag of bare feet on worn flagstone. There were no pipes, no taps, no flowing luxury. Water was carried in iron pails from the rain barrel or the well. Each drop was earned. Cold water for rinsing, warm water for soaking, scalding water for those rare sacred boils when the cloth bore something royal. The basin was carved from the very stone of the keep, a low oblong hollow, smoothed by centuries of lye and linen. It did not glimmer, it did not shine. It held its silence like a priest holds confession. Laundresses came in pairs, sometimes in threes, moving as one body, each gesture softened by repetition. They wore wool that never dried and hands cracked from the salts. They tied their sleeves with bone pins, their hair with wet string. Their names are not recorded, only their labor. In the quiet hours, before the sun rolled over the crenellations, the basin began to breathe. Steam coiled slowly from the water's surface, kissed by a red ember in the hearth. They soaked shifts and sheets in silence, rhythmically folding and unfolding as if rocking ghosts back to sleep. Some cloth was stained with wine, others with the birth of a child, others with things not named, only scrubbed until the fibers frayed. There was a rhythm to it. Soak, rub, rinse, wring, fold, soak, rub, rinse, wring, fold. Again, again, again. The walls were close, but the sound was wide, echoes folding into echoes, so that one whisper became a dozen. Water spilled over edges. Slippery moss bloomed at the base of the basin, trimmed back weakly with a dull knife. Sometimes they sang, not songs exactly, but half-hummed prayers passed down by those before. Not for salvation, not for glory, for weather, for warmth, for dry linen. Soap was rare, its making costly and foul. So they worked with ashes, herbs, and the sharp sting of urine left to ferment in clay pots. That too was poured into the basin. That too had a place in the ritual. And still, the noble ones above never spoke of it. Garments disappeared from their chests and returned whole again, as if purified by quiet magic. But those below knew each fabric by touch, the countess's embroidered shift, the chancellor's blood-flecked tunic, the newborn's first cloth, thinner than air. Each piece was held, cleaned, whispered over, and returned. The laundresses remembered stains the way monks remembered scripture. They read their marks, predicted their moods. Mud from the river path meant someone had fled. Char from the hearth meant a late-night fire. A hint of beeswax on a sleeve, a secret meeting in candlelight, a black blot of ink on a cuff, a confession that tried and failed to remain private. The basin held these truths quietly. In winter, the washing slowed. Fingers bled from cold stone. Water froze overnight in shallow skins of ice. Buckets cracked, and steam clung low to the ground like smoke from a drowned fire. Still, the work was done. Stains waited for no season. They hung the cloth on ropes above the hearth to dry, shifting it like sails above a sleeping crew. Below, the coals whispered. Above, the linen stirred like pale ghosts with nowhere else to go. The laundresses knew not to speak too much. Sound traveled strangely in castles, upwards, sideways, through grates and stairs and the hollow spaces in walls. They murmured instead, not from fear, but from knowing. Sometimes a garment never returned. Sometimes blood would not come out. Sometimes something was folded 3 times instead of 2, and that meant something. By late evening, the basin had cooled, and the laundresses scrubbed it clean with rosemary and thyme, not for purity, but for scent, to mask what was always beneath. The room would go quiet, the final cloths laid flat. The wooden paddles leaned against the wall like slumbering guards. One candle, one shadow, one last look. The stone floor stayed wet long after their feet had gone. The basin did not dry. It never truly did. Even long after the castle fell, after the walls crumbled and ivy took the windows, the basin remained, weather-worn and sunken, but intact, still holding rainwater, still remembering. And when travelers came, centuries later, they mistook it for a feeding trough or a place for animals to drink. But they were wrong. The basin had seen too much to forget, and in its damp silence, it waited still for one more cloth or one more secret to fall in. But deeper within the stone corridors, there was another ritual, where salt and shadow met at the seam. Before lye was boiled, before herbs were steeped in steam, there was salt. Salt, the first healer, the first scourge, the pale dust that entered the washrooms like quiet fire. It was measured not by weight, but by caution, ladled gently with a cracked spoon, stored in cloth pouches tied shut with twine. Salt was not wasted. Salt was not spoken of loudly. Salt was earned. In the laundry rooms of medieval castles, salt did not season food. It scoured the fibers of linen, coaxed out the secrets of stains that would not confess. Blood, sweat, wine, grease, ink. Each had its own stubbornness. Each had its own reply to salt. The laundresses knew this not through books, but through the slow trial of repetition. A dab here, a rub there, salt pressed into cloth with the heel of the hand, or soaked overnight in a wooden bowl beside the hearth. They used different salts when they could find them. Coarse sea salt when trade permitted. Finer salts harvested inland from brine springs. When salt ran low, they crushed burned bones into ash, sifted them fine, and mixed the powder with fermented urine, a stingingly effective brew that lifted even the oldest sins from cloth. Nothing smelled pleasant, but nothing stayed forever either. Salt worked slowly, like penance. It didn't shout like lye. It whispered. It erased in small circles, coaxing memory from thread. The laundresses watched as cloth surrendered, dark spots fading into pale halos, wine stains bleeding out like forgotten ink on parchment. They worked kneeling mostly, sometimes crouched, with their sleeves rolled up and their fingers raw. In the slow, briny silence, they performed a kind of alchemy, not gold from lead, but cleanness from ruin. A queen's dress, once stained in childbirth, took 3 days to purify. Salt for the bodily stain, ash for the scent, time for the fear. They did not speak of it above stairs, but the laundresses remembered. Salt had many uses, and some were not for cloth. A pinch thrown at the door to ward off ill will, a line of it traced under the bed of a sick child, a full pouch hung at the window during childbirth to draw evil away from the linen. Some salts were folded into garments before they were returned, sewn invisibly into seams. Superstition? Perhaps. But even the steward did not remove the salt when he found it. The laundry basin itself was salted on certain days, especially after a death. Salt was scrubbed into the basin's corners with stiff brushes of pine bristle. The water hissed when the salt met it, then grew still. It was not for disinfection, it was for memory, a ritual of rinsing away something heavier than dirt. Salt also made the cloth stiffer, harsher on the skin, but longer lasting. Garments that passed through salted hands held their shape longer. They returned with fewer creases, fewer stories. It was said that salt, used well, could erase not just the stain, but the reason for it. The laundresses sometimes joked, softly, never too loud, that salt knew too much, that if it could speak, it would spill every secret sewn into every sleeve. They called it white fire. In the ledgers, it was recorded in small amounts, a pound here, half a measure there, but no entry explained what it was used for. The nobles saw salt as a tax, a trade good, something to flavor meat or preserve fish. They did not see it dissolving into the fabric of their lives, one grain at a time, beneath the hands of women who were never called by name. Sometimes the salt turned pink. That was the blood. Sometimes it turned yellow. That was the bile. Sometimes it turned green. That was the mold, the sickness, the thing no one dared name. When that happened, they burned the cloth. If it could not be cleaned by salt, it could not be trusted. They hung salted linens over rosemary branches and let the scent take hold. The stiff fabric caught wind in the drying room, snapping softly like sails far from sea. Mice avoided salted cloth, and so did spirits, it was said. Some nights, one of the older women, with shaking hands and a soot-lined face, would mix salt with ash and water and whisper a prayer over the mixture. Not a saint's name, something older, something from before the castle stood. She would dip a finger into the brine and mark the basin's edge. Just a line, just once. No one asked why. There was no formal ritual, but everyone paused until it was done. The apprentices learned salt first, before wringing, before folding. They learned by watching. They learned by tasting. A drop on the tongue told them how strong, how old, how well it had kept its sting. Salt from a damp barrel had gone soft, useless. Salt exposed to smoke had turned bitter, still usable, but only for certain stains. They stored it in linen pouches, each marked by a stitch or a color: red for blood, blue for oil, black for soot. Unmarked pouches were for general use, though even these were guarded. Salt was currency. Salt was memory. Salt was a whisper passed from one set of hands to another, down through generations that history forgot. The basin held some of it, always, trapped in the cracks of the stone, pressed into the seams of the old floor. Even now, if you poured water into the ruins of a laundry room, it might hiss softly, just a little, just once. And beyond the salted basin, heat rose from the cauldron, boiling cloth, breath, and something else entirely. Before dawn, before bells, before the courtyard stirred, there was boiling. The fire was built low, slow, fed with damp wood to stretch its breath. It crackled under the iron cauldron, a black mouth that never cooled, The laundresses approached in silence, their arms full of folded burden, their steps slow across the wet stone. The cauldron groaned as it warmed. Inside, water trembled, then rolled. Bubbles rose like breath from something sleeping beneath. And when the lye was added, soft white powder from ash and chalk, the hiss began. Into this hiss, cloth was lowered. Not all cloth, only the ones marked for it. Noble shifts with lace cuffs, undergarments of those who bled or birthed or sinned, garments too delicate for salt, too stained for scrubbing. The boil was both cleansing and ceremonial, not punishment, not entirely, but close. The laundresses used paddles carved from oak, smooth, water-swollen, worn by 1,000 stirrings. They moved the garments slowly, pushing them down, holding them under. Bubbles escaped from folds. Steam rose in fragrant waves. Lavender, thyme, bay leaves, added for their oils, for their scent, for their old and wordless powers. Sometimes, a cloth rose to the surface too soon. The laundresses would press it back down with the paddle, whispering nothing, their brows furrowed, not in anger, but in rhythm. It had to boil long enough, until the memory left the thread. They did not call it cooking, but sometimes it smelled that way. The boiling water turned gray, then brown, then black. A gown once white became pale again, not pure, but surrendered. They lifted it out with wooden tongs, steaming and limp, and laid it across a waiting bench of stone. And it waited, dripped, steamed. The chamber filled with breath, not from mouths, but from water. It fogged the windows. It traced the outlines of women moving back and forth, ghost-like behind their labor. Once, a laundress dropped a cloth too quickly and splashed her hand. The burn turned pink, then raw, then white. She did not cry. She rubbed vinegar on the wound and kept stirring. The garments did not wait. They worked by scent and by sound. When the lavender faded, the water was spent. When the bubbling grew shallow, the cauldron asked for more. The fire, like the laundresses, never fully slept. And always, the boiling came before the bells. The castle woke to warm linen, to cloth that smelled of fields and smoke, to underthings folded with corners aligned just so. The nobles never asked how it was done. They simply reached for it in the morning, wrapping themselves in something that had been boiled and beaten and blessed by those far below. There were rules, even here. Cloth worn in childbirth could not be boiled with that worn in mourning. Cloth touched by the dead must be boiled last, and the water thrown away in silence, far from the well. Boiling water could not touch holy garments. The priest's robes were scrubbed with vinegar and sun-dried, never stirred. Some cloths, they were told, carried spirits, and though they didn't believe it, not truly, they never boiled more than one noble's linens at a time, just in case. They told stories while stirring, softly. The one about the maid who fell into the cauldron, not real, but real enough to make them hold their balance. The one about the knight whose tunic burned in the boiling pot, and who died the next day on a hunt. They did not say it was connected, but they never boiled his family's garments again. Superstition drifted in the steam, like oil on broth. It curled around ankles, settled on hair, and faded with the morning. No one knew who had boiled first, who had stirred the first pot in the first castle, but the practice endured, passed down hand to hand, as tightly held as a prayer. Apprentices were taught slowly, one cloth at a time, one herb, one rule. Too hot, and the linen burned. Too cool, and the stains stayed. Too long, and the garment tore at the seams, unraveling like a forgotten vow. They learned to listen, to the fire, to the water, to the breath of boiling itself. Some days it bubbled angry, snapping and spitting. Some days it sighed. Boiling had moods, and sometimes they boiled things not for stains, but for silence. A letter sewn into the hem of a shift, a token tucked into a sleeve, a cloth no longer needed, but never to be found again. These were dropped into the pot with no record, boiled until their meaning bled out, lifted, limp, and hung to dry, then used for rags. The cauldron held no judgment, only heat. They cleaned it weekly, scraping its sides with salt and ash. Once a month, they poured the contents into the earth behind the castle, a black patch where nothing grew. The laundresses called it the dark garden. No one else asked about it. There was peace in the boil, the certainty of method, the silence that came when the last cloth was lifted and wrung out, and the fire hissed itself to sleep. By then, the sun had reached the window. The first bells rang from the chapel, and above the cauldron's lip, steam still danced, like memories that didn't want to go. And there, among the folded linen, a stain remained, one that no amount of boiling could ever quite explain. The castle's linen did not lie. It folded itself into silence, yes, pressed into tight bundles, stacked high in cedar chests. But the threads remembered. They held what the mouth would not say. And when the sun fell low and the fire turned to embers, the laundresses read them like scripture. They did not need ink. They had stains. Not all were visible at once. Some only revealed themselves in steam, others in sunlight. A few, the worst, emerged in the quiet, under breath, under time. There was the hem of a nobleman's shirt, always stiff with red, a small place, always reappearing, no matter how much salt was pressed into it. They said it came from a duel long past, a wound that hadn't healed, reopened each time pride was tested. They never asked whose blood it was. It did not matter. It always returned. There was the queen's shift, pale as candle wax, touched with the faint brown of old sorrow. Not blood, not quite. A deeper thing. It came after the castle doctor had visited 3 times in 1 week, after the chapel bells rang twice at dawn, after a servant girl left and did not return. The shift had been folded with care, cleaned but not scrubbed. Its stain was not to be erased, only softened. Some stains bore no sadness, only secrets. Ink, dark and bloomed along the edge of a cuff. The kind of stain that smudged a letter, or a record, or a signature not meant to be traced. A laundress once pressed that sleeve between her fingers and whispered, "He signed it alone." They did not read, but they knew. There were wine stains from the feast, berry purple, fragrant even after rinsing. Sometimes the wine was spilled in laughter. Other times, it was flung. One dress returned with a tear at the collar and a wine mark shaped like a hand. The fabric told all, if one knew how to listen. The younger laundresses learned slowly. At first, they saw only color, then texture, then shape, then meaning. A round brown spot, stew perhaps, a narrow splash, oil spilled while rushing, a set of 3, wax from a dripping candle, a lover's letter read by shaking hands. Then there were the burns, not stains exactly, but shadows of flame. The edge of a nightgown curled black, as if held too close to the hearth, a scarf with a hole that had not unraveled, only singed, the marks of a torch too near, or a candle knocked sideways during tears. They never asked, they only folded, but they remembered. One cloth returned with a stain they did not recognize, pale yellow, sweet-smelling, familiar, but wrong. It took days before one of the older women named it, poppy milk. used to quiet pain or erase it. Someone had wrapped a body in it once. Some garments were cleaned twice, not for dirt, but for emotion, as if washing could erase what happened while worn. There was a linen underskirt, worn by a young lady whose name fluttered through the halls like a dove. She had danced, they said, and fallen. Some said fainted, others said jumped. The skirt came back folded tight, but not well, wrinkled, damp in parts. Its stains were soft gray, not of blood, but of stone, and moss, and fear. The laundresses boiled it, but the marks did not lift. They hung it near the roof and let wind take it instead. When it returned, it was changed. Not clean, not stained, just finished. They folded it without a word and placed it at the bottom of the chest. Then there were the invisible stains, the ones that never colored the cloth, but changed it anyway. A sheet returned too stiff, a tunic that smelled faintly of copper, a towel that had been folded wrong, as if by a trembling hand. These bore no marks, but they held weight, and the laundresses carried it. Even the way cloth folded told its tale. A garment folded hastily, someone left in a rush. One folded tightly, someone didn't want to be found. One returned unfolded, crumpled in a basket. Someone was afraid. The laundresses knew how to fold by feel, by breath, by memory. A nobleman's shift folded wrong could be seen as an insult. A lady's veil creased at the edge could summon quiet wrath. They worked carefully, but not because they feared, because they remembered. Because each fold, each thread, each mark spoke. And sometimes the stains returned, weeks later, months, after marriages, after burials. A cloth came back with a mark thought vanished, a ghost reappearing under steam. One woman said it was memory rising. Another said it was justice. Still, they worked. They washed. They scrubbed. They steeped in ash and time. They folded and refolded. They carried the stories in their fingers, their palms, their silence. Some days, one of them would pause, mid-fold, and whisper, "She wept in this one. Nothing more, nothing less." The others nodded. That was all it took. In the stillness between labor and sleep, they saw the castle not through its lords, but through its linens, its softness, its damage, its marks. The scribes had their ink, the guards had their swords, the laundresses had stains, and they read history backwards, from the fray of the cuff to the bruise of a spill, to the moment a life changed without a sound. In the quietest part of the castle, high above the boil and basin, the drying room waited, full of wind, ghosts, and unfinished breath. At the top of the castle, just beneath the beams, there lived a room the noble eyes never saw. It had no name in the ledgers, no mark on the maps, but the laundresses knew it by heart. They called it the dry room, or simply the above. There was no heat there, only wind. It slipped in through the narrow arrow slits, hissing along the stone, touching every damp hem with its ghost fingers. It came soft in spring, furious in winter, and bored in summer. And still, the linens were brought up, armful by armful, warm from the cauldron or cold from the basin, dripping onto the stairwell with every step. The dry room smelled of many things: old straw, damp wood, time, and faintly, always, of sleep. Linen was hung on lines of twine, stretched from beam to beam. Some sagged with age, others snapped without warning. When the castle was young, they used hemp rope. Later, when the rope maker died, they used twisted flax. Nothing held forever. The women worked quickly, with hands still wrinkled from washing. They draped the cloth carefully, folding the edges just so. leaving space for wind to pass through. Creases were smoothed with the heel of the hand. Nothing was rushed. A poorly dried shift bred mildew, and mildew bred whispers. Mildew meant failure. Failure meant suspicion. And suspicion, in castles, had teeth. In the dry room, silence was tradition. Not sacred, not superstitious, simply sensible. Sound behaved oddly there. It echoed down chimney flues and stairwells. It drifted into the armory, the kitchens, even the chapel. One laugh could be mistaken for mockery. One careless word could bloom into rumor. So the laundresses whispered, or did not speak at all. Instead, they listened. To the drip of the last cloth, to the whine of twine pulled too tight, to the slow creak of the upper beams shifting under centuries of wind. They listened too for the rats. The dry room had them, fat, velvet-footed, fond of warmth. They nested in the hay spread beneath the lines, where falling drops could not pool. The women did not fear them. The rats stayed low, and the linen hung high. There was a treaty of silence between them. Now and then, a shift would fall. It never returned to the noble's chest. Anything that touched the hay was considered altered, changed by dampness, by rat dander, by something invisible and irreversible. It was cut into strips and stored for mopping wounds or wiping blades. A quiet demotion. No one spoke of it. The cloth simply changed purpose. In summer, the dry room filled with light. A gold sort of heat pooled under the rafters, and linen dried quickly. The air was heavy with thyme and lemon balm. Everything smelled clean, but overexposed, as if the sun could see too much. In winter, the dry room bit. The wind came with knives in its teeth. Frost climbed the stone walls like ivy. Linen froze mid-drip, stiff, crystalline, impossible to fold. The laundresses worked in layers, fingers numb, breath clouding the air like ghost prayers. They rubbed vinegar into their hands to keep the cold from cracking the skin. Still, the linen had to dry. They learned to feel it by touch, not sight. A cloth that seemed dry could still whisper dampness along the seams. One could not trust the air, only the weight, the tension, the feel between finger and thumb. Some garments never dried completely, especially in grief. There was one gown, pale green, thickly woven, that took 7 days to dry. It belonged to a lady whose name no longer lived in books, but in the dry room, her story remained. They said she wore the gown to a funeral, her own. It hung at the far beam, near the western slit where wind rarely reached. It sagged for days. The drops fell not loudly, but with a hush, as if apologizing. When it was finally dry, no one folded it. They left it hanging overnight, alone, then burned it in the hearth below. Some linens were marked with wax, not noble wax, not the kind that sealed letters or decrees, but small, accidental stamps from candle drips. They hardened into the cloth, softened in the dry room heat, then vanished. But a faint shine remained, like a memory you can't quite hold. The dry room was a place of transition, wet to dry, use to rest, labor to return. It was where the cloth remembered the body, the shape of a sleeve bent at the elbow, the looseness at the collar, the place where a hem had frayed from too much movement. When the wind passed through, the linen stirred as if trying to return to the shape it once held. Sometimes, the women said the linen moved too much. They blamed it on wind, on draft, on their own tiredness. But some garments swayed when the air was still. A gown fluttered with no window open. A shift turned on the line, though no one touched it. They did not speak of it. They folded slowly. They left space for silence. And when the last cloth was dry, They lifted it gently, held it to their cheek, not to feel warmth, but to feel that it had ended, then folded it thrice and placed it in the basket lined with rosemary. The wind grew quiet then. The ropes eased their strain, and the dry room slept again, until the next cloth rose like a ghost. But beneath the dried linen and folded ghosts, numbers were being inked into a ledger, one thread at a time. In a small windowless chamber beside the steward's hall, a record was kept, not of gold, not of war, not of names carved in stone. It was the book of linen, bound in goat leather, rubbed smooth by centuries of touch. The laundry ledger rested on a sloped desk. It bore no title on the cover, only a small iron clasp and a faint scent of beeswax. Inside, its pages were heavy with lists, numbers, fibers, measures, scrawled in a hand shaped by patience and ink. Each line marked the passage of cloth, a sheet given, a towel returned, a shift requested, a napkin stained beyond rescue. The pen moved slowly, deliberately, in brown-black strokes that dried in the cold air of the castle's walls. Ink, like linen, was rationed, and both remembered more than they showed. The steward's scribe was an old man with crooked fingers and eyes that saw patterns in shadows. He wore gloves cut at the fingertips and dipped his quill no deeper than needed. His Latin was spare, his margins tight, but he could tell the story of the castle from the shape of a stains note. Lintea, macerata, linen, soaked. Sudor regis, sinistra, sweat of the king, left side. Albae feminae, postpartum, white cloths, post-childbirth. Nothing more, nothing less. And yet, in those lines, entire rooms echoed. The ledger did not judge, it only recorded. But the act of recording made things known, at least to those with access, and access was rare. The laundresses never saw the book. They reported verbally to a woman called the keeper, who counted cloth with quiet breath and eyes that moved faster than her feet. She stood beside the scribe and translated the day's numbers into syllables. She did not explain. She did not elaborate. 7 shifts, 3 spotted, 1 burnt, 1 missing. The scribe did not lift his eyes. He inked only what was required. Brachai, ustulatai, undergarments, scorched. Sudarium, periot. Handkerchief, lost. Loss had its place. Even linen eventually went missing, but not often, not without notice. The margin beside a lost cloth often bore a mark, not a word, a dot, a curve, a faded X, a code. One the steward could read, but would not share. Some losses were allowed, others were watched. Sometimes the ink darkened in those places, heavier lines pressed deeper into the page. The sign of suspicion, of linen gone not by fire or mold, but by theft. Linen was currency. A noble's shift could be sold. A servant's apron traded. Even a towel from the bishop's quarters fetched coin at the market beyond the walls. So the book was guarded. At night, it was locked in an iron box beneath the steward's desk, beside keys and seals and scraps of old parchment. Only he and the scribe knew how many garments passed through the keep in a season. No lord asked, but all trusted the linen would appear, clean and ready. The book ensured it. It was not just a ledger, it was a memory, folded in numbers, pressed in ink. Some pages smelled faintly of rosemary, pressed between their leaves to mark the start of winter. Others bore oil marks, where the scribe had paused with his lamp too close. A few were torn, replaced, stitched back into the binding with thread spun from cloth once ruined. And at the back of the book, in a hand unlike the rest, there was a list without headings, a quiet catalog. Sudarium, vanished. Shift, no return. Blood, persistent. Oil, unexplained. Infant cloth, never claimed. No numbers, no names, just memory. Perhaps the scribe had grown tired of forgetting. The ledger was sometimes read aloud, in part, during inspections. The steward would murmur the names of things to the visiting auditor. 11 sheets, 6 veils, 23 napkins. The words fell like raindrops on old stone. The nobles nodded, distracted. They did not listen closely. They heard numbers, not fabric. But the linen heard. Each count was a reckoning of labor, of loss, of silence. And when a cloth went missing, the ledger held its space. A blank line, an unfinished row. The space where ink should have gone, but didn't. Not a mistake. A breath. Even breath had its place. One page bore a smear. Ink rushed across the margin as if the scribe's hand had trembled. Next to it, only 2 words. Infans mortua. Dead infant. No cloth listed, no size, no stain, no recovery. That page was never turned during inspection. The book grew heavier with time, not in weight, but in gravity. It sagged slightly in the middle, where the years of sickness were recorded. Whole pages marked only with numbers crossed out. Cloth that was burned, cloth that was buried, cloth that carried fever in its weave. The scribe wore gloves in those years. He wrote slower. He dipped the quill with care. Still, the ink faded faster then, as if the memory itself wished to vanish. In spring, they sometimes opened the ledger to let it breathe, just for a few hours. The pages curled slightly in the sun, not enough to warp, just enough to remember what warmth felt like. Then it was closed again, pressed shut with lavender, returned to its chamber. Even the book needed rest. But not all cloth was counted. Some lay hidden, curled in cedar and guarded by mice. Beneath the servants' stairwell, in the shallow dark where no torch burned long, rested a row of cedar chests. They were old, older than the stone laid above them, older than the castle's second bell, perhaps even older than the families who once ruled the keep. Their lids bore rings from candle bottoms and scratches from careless heels. But still, the chests remained dry, and more importantly, unchewed. The mice respected the cedar. It was not the scent alone, though that helped. The wood gave off a bitter perfume, sharp at the edges, dry as old spice. But there was also something else, a kind of memory stored in the grain. The cedar had soaked in centuries of loss, and the mice, in their small animal wisdom, understood to tread lightly. Within the chests were linens no longer in use, cloths too precious to burn, too haunted to reuse. Each one folded flat, wrapped in paper or herbs, and marked with a thin scrap of vellum. A single word or two. No dates, no names. Veil, blood, stillborn, dowry, unused. They were not forgotten garments. They were waiting ones, waiting for customs to change, waiting for grief to loosen, waiting for someone brave enough to open the lid. The cedar kept them from mold. The dark kept them from gossip. And so they remained, untouched by time, yet heavy with it. Some pieces were wedding shifts, woven years before a betrothal, stitched with initials of a girl whose match was never made. Some were christening cloths for children never born. Others were shrouds, used once, washed twice, then wrapped away in rosemary and silence. Not all bore tragedy. One was simply labeled unspoken, a linen handkerchief, finely made, with a stitch pattern that matched no known heraldry. The corners were mended, but not evenly, as if done in haste. It had a faint scent of cloves. The mice never touched it. Another, marked promise, was a half robe, the kind worn on midsummer nights, hemmed in gold thread, still crisp, never washed, a garment made for joy, never reached. The chests were opened only once each season. It was called the airing. Not a ritual, not a rite, simply a habit passed from laundress to laundress. On the last day of summer, when the sun lingered on the high windows and the wind smelled faintly of apples, they brought out the cedar chests and lifted each lid with 2 hands, slowly, gently, without breath. The linens inside were unfolded, but not shaken. No dust was raised, no folds were broken more than needed. They were carried to the inner courtyard, where no noble walked, and laid in rows upon straw mats in the sun, not for drying, not for cleaning, just for remembering. The airing was silent. No songs, no chatter. A hush fell across the courtyard like snowfall, though the day was bright. Even the birds seemed to hush. Perhaps they too remembered. The youngest laundress was always given the chest labeled child bed. It was small, lighter than the rest. It smelled of fennel and beeswax. Inside were cloths used during births, both joyous and grim. There were blood-stained towels folded into clean squares, linen cords once tied to wrists, small caps made for heads that never grew. No one knew who they belonged to. The midwives never said, and so the cloths became quiet things, folded, dried, stored in cedar. The mice ran past them, respectfully. Not all cloths in the chests were white. Some were gray with age, others pale pink or soft gold. One had once been blue, but now lived somewhere between ash and memory. A few were patterned, checkered with red lines, woven in distant towns. A gift, perhaps, a bride's dowry from beyond the hills. One chest was marked with an old dialect word, tristad, meaning the forgetting. Inside were rags, torn pieces of larger cloths, not catalogued, not counted, but folded just the same. They had no names, no marks, no scent but linen and time. Some had threads pulled free, as if someone had once begun to unmake them, but stopped. Why were they kept? No one knew. But the chests remained full. Each year, after the airing, the cloths were refolded, never the same way twice, as if to give them new rest. They were layered with sprigs of dried sage or crushed cedar bark, then laid back in the chests, soft side down, corners smoothed, the lids closed with a breath, and the stairwell returned to shadow. No noble asked what was in the chests. Perhaps they didn't know. Perhaps they preferred not to. Mourning was a servant's duty, and the cloths of grief were best kept low, beneath stone, with the mice and the memory. Once, during a time of famine, the steward suggested burning some of the old linen for heat. The laundresses said nothing. But the next morning, the cedar chests had been moved deeper, beneath the old stair, where the mice kept better watch. None were burned, not one. The linen of mourning, of stillbirths and promises unmet, had become part of the castle, as much as the archways or the bell tower, a soft, unseen weight beneath the stone. And so they remained, not buried, not forgotten, just sleeping. But while some cloths were hidden in cedar, others were carried in procession, drenched in scent and sacred song. There were cloths that left the laundry only once, cloths that did not return for washing or repair, cloths anointed, not scrubbed, steeped in oil, not water, measured not by inches, but by the final breath they touched. In the chapel's rear chamber, behind the altar rail and the cold candle bins, lay a cupboard bound in iron. Its hinges groaned softly, like old prayers. Within were linens meant for sacred tasks, shrouds, towels, processional veils. They bore no sigils and no thread of gold, but they were holy by use. Some bore the oil of chrism, thick, perfumed, dark as amber, sealed in glass by the bishop's own hand. These cloths were folded in silence and tied with faded blue cord. When the cord was loosened, the scent rose like myrrh, dry and sweet, clinging to the lungs. These were not everyday linens. They were brought out when death visited the castle, not the sudden death of soldiers or the quiet fading of servants. These cloths were reserved for noble passings, for those who died in a bed surrounded by candlelight and whispered psalms, for those whose bodies were kept one more night, so the cloth could perform its ancient duty. The oil was rubbed into the linen, then across the brow of the deceased. A thin towel pressed the hands, a wider sheet wrapped the feet, and then, slowly, reverently, the final cloth was placed. Not heavy, not thick, just enough to cover the face and chest, woven of flax harvested in the summer of the last Jubilee, whitened with ash, softened with sun. No more than that. Then the body was carried, and the cloth went with it, through the halls, past the watching candles and silent stone, down the nave, through the gate, into the earth. The cloths were not returned. They were interred with the dead, or burned with them in times of plague, or sealed in lead coffins where the scent of oil lingered longest. The laundresses never spoke of them. The cupboard was kept by the chaplain's aides, and when the oils ran low, a fresh vial arrived by courier, sealed in wax, marked only with a cross and a date. Some cloths in the cupboard were not for the dead. One was used during the elevation, a square of fine linen that caught any crumb or drop from the sacred host. It was laundered, but not with soap, only with wine and boiling spring water, drawn at dawn. It was pressed between two stones, then dried in the wind, replaced each Lent, and burned quietly behind the chapel. Another cloth hung in procession, a veil, long and narrow, carried on feast days when relics passed through the castle. It caught the dust of the road, the breath of the watching crowd, the occasional tear from an unseen mourner. No one touched it with bare hands, gloves only, and only in spring. When it frayed, it was not patched. It was folded, oiled, stored, then forgotten. There were cloths that bore blood. Holy blood, they called it, though it was just the blood of a noble wounded at the altar, or a priest who fainted in midsummer and struck his brow. These cloths were kept, not laundered. A corner cut, a date noted in script too old to read, then set in a small drawer, dry and spotted, sacred by accident. Not all sacred cloths came from the chapel. In the old apothecary room, where herbs once hung from rafters like sleeping birds, there was a chest marked with a faded symbol, part cross, part shears. Inside were towels used in healing, wrapped around fevers, tied across ribs, soaked in vinegar and rose water. Some bore strange stains, green edges, crystals where salt had dried. One towel had a hole in the center, singed. No record explained it. The healers had gone generations ago, but the towels remained, folded, kept, respected. Once, in the year the comet passed, the castle's midwife requested a special linen from the holy cupboard, something already steeped in oil, already touched by light, a cloth that had never seen soap. She needed it for a birth that had not yet begun. They gave her a shroud. She folded it differently. When the child was born, she wrapped it once, then twice, then laid the bundle on the stone floor of the chapel. The oil seeped through, staining the floor in a faint shape like wings. The stain was never scrubbed. Over time, it grew darker, not by pigment, by memory. That cloth was never seen again. Some said the mice carried it away. Others said the linen was buried beneath the altar. No one checked. There are cloths that do not wish to be found again. and those who work with oil know to let them rest. The cupboard was rarely full, but it was never quite empty. A rotation of sacred fibers, some fragrant, some stiff, some whisper thin, moved through the seasons like wind through a veil. The cloths changed, but the silence stayed the same. They were not recorded in the linen book. They were not counted by the steward. They were not discussed by the women in the laundry rooms or the men who lit the chapel fires. But still, they passed through hands, through time, through loss. When the cupboard was cleaned, once every 10 years, on the Feast of the Forgotten Saints, the cloths were lifted, one by one, and folded anew. Gloves were worn. Prayers were murmured. No one asked what each stain meant. No one dared. After the cleaning, the doors were closed with a soft iron thud, and another 10 years began. Some cloths bore oil and breath, but others only ash, wind, and memory. It did not begin as cleanliness. It began as fire. When something burned, bone, branch, bread crusts, even scraps of linen, what remained was ash. Pale, fragile, useless it seemed. But in the damp hollows behind medieval kitchens and castle halls, where hearths burned for days without pause, this ash was saved, not swept, not discarded. Saved, in barrels, in sacks, in clay basins tucked beside the firewood, not for warmth, but for transformation. Ash, when steeped in rainwater, became lye, and lye, when mixed with fat, became soap. But this was not the soap of sweet scent or silken skin. It was strong, dark, and acrid. It bit the hands. It stripped cloth of life. It hissed when stirred. And still, it was cherished. Each castle had its method. Some used oak ash, others birch. The oldest recipes called for the burning of deer antler, when it could be spared, to create a sharper lye. The ash was left to soak in rainwater caught from the northern gutter, never the southern, which was thought unlucky. The mixture sat for days. Then it was strained through straw and wool, dripped into wooden basins that darkened over time. The resulting liquid, thin, clear, and quietly caustic, was stored in stoppered jars. Children were warned not to touch it. Even the laundresses kept it separate from their usual basins. Lye had a different scent, not of cleanliness, but of memory, like smoke and old stones. To make soap, lye was warmed and poured over tallow. Fat rendered from cattle or sheep melted until it shone. The two resisted each other at first. Then they combined, grudgingly, into a thick paste. It was stirred with wooden paddles, never metal, stirred in circles, always clockwise, always slow. The soapmaker wore no perfume. Scent would not survive here. She moved without rush, face veiled in damp cloth, hands wrapped in linen. If she had assistants, they were silent. No one laughed around the soap. It was considered rude, like laughter at a funeral. Some batches failed. They curdled, cracked, refused to set. The castle's steward would note it, frown, and set the paddle aside. Soap that failed could still be used, for scrubbing floors or treating lice in old wool, but not for cloths that touched the skin of lords and children. The good batches were poured into molds, wooden, stone, or simply hand-shaped. They cooled by the hearth, hardening, darkening, becoming something useful, something sharp. Then they were cut and stored and aged. Soap was not used immediately. It was left to breathe for weeks, sometimes months. When cured too soon, it stung. When aged just right, it softened, slightly, like a stone warmed by the sun. The finished bars bore no color, no swirl, no scent, but the faint breath of smoke and tallow. Some castles stamped them with symbols, a circle, a cross, a pair of shears. No two stamps were alike, and none were explained. The first use of a bar was a quiet ceremony. It was unwrapped, soaked briefly in warm water, then rubbed on the most stained cloth, usually something from the noble bedchamber. Sheets or underlinen bearing the marks of birth or illness or love. The laundress would whisper a prayer to Saint Martha, not loudly, just beneath breath, and begin. She did not rush. The soap was not generous. It resisted. It required pressure, patience, warmth. It burned the skin if used too long. It bleached cloth if left too still. But when handled well, it worked. The stain would fade. The cloth would return to its former quiet. Sometimes the soap was used for hair, once a month or less, mixed with crushed rosemary and goat's milk, applied outdoors in cold air while the hair steamed and shivered, rinsed with river water, followed by silence. Many preferred to go without, and yet the soap was sacred. One bar was kept in the chapel, not for cleaning, but for touch. The chaplain's assistant would press it to the hands of the dying if water was not near. A final cleansing, a final scent. The soap was not rubbed, only held. One bar was stored near the birthing stool, not for the child, but for the mother's cloth. Some said it softened the sorrow, though no one explained how. One bar, sometimes, was buried. When a servant died without family, a piece of the soap that last touched their skin was tucked into the folds of their linen wrap, not for cleanliness, but for memory, as if the cloth might remember its purpose in the soil. Soap was used sparingly. Most washing still relied on ash alone, or fermented urine, or crushed herbs. But soap was the castle's hush, its private ritual, its small, clean grief. In the castle's records, there is mention of a winter when no soap could be made. The fires had failed. The cattle were too few for tallow. Ash turned bitter in the snow. That winter, no sheets were cleaned, no berths were prepared, no cloths anointed. When the spring came, the first bar made was not used. It was sealed in a wooden box and hidden. No one recorded where, only that it was kept for the last cloth. Perhaps it was never needed. Perhaps it waits still, in a stone recess, wrapped in linen, holding the scent of burnt things and the promise of something clean. And beneath the last basin, behind the last stone, a pale thread remains, unwoven, unwashed, unnamed. The fire fades, the linens cool, and the castle returns to shadow. Let the hush carry you now, past stone walls and salt basins, into dreams older than memory. Sleep well, traveler of quiet time. Another whisper waits, just beyond the candle's last flicker. Good night.